Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. I'm your host for this week. My name is Ian Fisher, and we're going to do a little bit of travel on the show today, not to any particular place, but to types of places. In our second segment, which we're not starting with, we're going to go and talk a little bit about rural college environments and what it's like to be a student, well, to use a pejorative, out in the middle of nowhere. And I think we'll be corrected on that concept. But first, we want to talk about what it's like to go to college in a city. And to do that, we're fortunate enough to be joined by a couple of our college coach experts who went to college in a city. So did I, but apparently I can't just host a segment with only me on the show. So joining us today, we've got Lauren Randall, who is here today because she is an alumna of Georgetown University. Hi, Lauren.
Hi, Ian.
And we've also got Tova Javits, who is joining us, who is an alumna of Barnard College in New York
Sure.
City. Hi, Tova.
Hi. Hello.
So what I'm curious about before we can start is I would like to know where each of you went to high school, what the setting was in that particular space, and how that idea of going to college in a city might have been attractive to you given where you were growing up. So Lauren, why don't we start with you? You're at the top of my screen, so we're just going to start with you.
Sure. I grew up in South Jersey, as far south as you can get, at a shore vacation type town. It's awesome in the summer, not a lot to do in the winter. And I knew what was important to me was being within driving distance from home. I did not want to get on a plane, but I knew I needed more action. So I started my college search 100% convinced I was going to NYU. I wanted to be in New York. My mom went to NYU, and that's where I belonged. I ended up at Georgetown. We can get there, but I knew I needed more than the beach.
Very interesting. Tova, what about you? Where did you grow up, and what were you thinking when you were choosing where you'd like to apply?
I grew up in farm country, Pennsylvania, what is called Amish country, Pennsylvania, in not such a small town, Lebanon, next to Lancaster and Hershey and Reading. But all of our family was in the New York metro area. And I actually went to high school, to answer you directly, in suburban New York. I boarded at a school. And I too knew I wanted to be in New York City, although I didn't deviate from that, Lauren. I went on a tour of NYU, but I knew, as all 17-year-olds know, that I wanted to go to Columbia. And I was certain until I took a tour and realized that it was not the school for me. But I did know I wanted to be in New York City. And I can admit that was not well researched or founded. It was out of lack of idea of other cities. It was a city that I knew. And I knew being in a big city was a big draw for me.
New York City is in many ways the city. And I don't mean to critique Chicago or Los Angeles or even San Francisco, but New York City is the city. And I went to school in Portland. Technically, I went to school in a city as well, but there's a real difference from Reed College in Portland, Oregon, to Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., to Barnard College or NYU in New York City. How should students think a little bit about the differences? Because you will have students say, I want more action. I want to be at school in a city. Lauren, what does it mean to actually have access to that action as opposed to simply having your campus situated within the city limits?
First, I think any city or with access to action, you're going to have it no matter where you go. There's a big difference between college and high school. Let's just be very clear. Yeah. Independence gives you access to action, right? So I think regardless, you're going to have that access in a very new and different way. But there is a difference in cities. Charleston is different than Chicago, and Miami is different than New York. I still think, defining some things that are important to you, whether that is driving distance or being on a plane, whether that is having a defined, closed off kind of campus, or you really want to be in the thick of it and be very urban and live in, basically what feels like a hotel. Weather could be important to you. I was not going to be happy. I love Chicago, too cold. Yeah. And also Miami was too hot. So, it's that Goldilocks effect. So but I think, there is a difference of being in a city and having access. It does become part of your college experience.
Mm.
And that was very much the case for me at Georgetown, even though when I compare it to my friends that went to George Washington, that is far more urban, even within the city than Georgetown is, of what that meant of my daily experience interacting with the city.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think, Toba, in
Well, I
terms of
think
thinking
that
about those differences?
distinction's really important. And when students say they want to go to a school in a city, it's important to think about what does that mean for a campus. And what Lauren said is a defined campus. Are you a school that is in and of the city? When you're walking around downtown Manhattan, can you not differentiate between a building that is an NYU building or a new school building, other than it happens to have a flag outside? Or have you crossed 116th Street and Broadway and now you enter the gates of Barnard College and you are in a gated area, or at Fordham University, where I also used to work? When you're standing in the middle of Fordham's campus in the Bronx, you would never know you're in New York City. You look around and you're in the middle of any campus in New England. And it looks just like every campus you've ever seen in every movie, because they're all actually filmed at Fordham, by the way. And it is a very different physical feel than perhaps NYU or GW, where you are in and of the city. That's the language a lot of those schools use. And thinking about when you close your eyes and you picture what you want college to look like, is having a quad and seeing people play Frisbee important to you? And does that have to happen at Central Park or like a big public park? Or do you want that in a quad with Gothic architecture and buildings that look like college, like you see it in the movies? Or are you down for being part of a city?
Yeah, and it's an important question. And I think that like being in a city has just that geographic definition, which is just where it's located. But then there's also this kind of interaction that you get with the city. And I'm curious because I think with Reed, Portland is a big draw for Reed, but I don't actually think that Reed needs to be in Portland in order to be able to do the kind of educational and social experience that it does. It could be picked up, airlifted, and dropped somewhere else, and it would be very, very similar in terms of the experience. A lot of students would miss out on that chance to go down to Powell's Books or to interact with Portland, but I don't see that as an essential part of the experience. It's a feature, but not essential. I get the impression, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, that that is not true with Georgetown. That's not true with Barnard, that the location is really central to the identity of the school and the experience that just about every student has at that school. Is that something that resonates with you, Lauren, and Georgetown?
Does Lauren always get to go first here?
I was going to do you just for the sake of like not being a broken
Go
record.
ahead, Lauren.
But like you just talked. And so I'm kind of over it. So I want to hear what Lauren has to say.
Yes and no, Ian, you're both right and wrong here. In terms of my experience with Georgetown, I do, it is a big part of being in Washington, DC as a Georgetown student. I didn't know anybody who did not intern, right? That was part of the experience. We got in our power suits and we got on a bus and we went to our internships. That was part of my yearly experience, not just my summer experience. So that was part of the living, learning experience in Washington, DC. And that was, if you didn't take advantage of it, what a wasted opportunity, right? That's really how I felt. And I think that's how all Georgetown students feel. But on a day-to-day, I mean, maybe some students go on a first date to some of the Smithsonian's or things like, but no, on a day-to-day, I was not in the city. Besides my internship experience, which for me, it was very professionally driven. And once every 4 years, you attend inauguration. But being in DC, besides, it was not a daily interaction unless it was for my professional development in my internships.
Yeah, that's a great point. Tova, when you woke up on campus every morning, did you wake up and think I'm at Barnard, or did you wake up thinking I'm in New York? Like, what was your general feel of daily life?
So I have one distinct memory that I was just joking around with my college roommates that I'm still tight with. And I remember our very first night on campus, sitting in the windowsill, looking out onto the street. And I looked over at my roommate. I was like, we are literally on Broadway. Our residence hall looked out onto Broadway, as in the Broadway.
Yeah.
Like, this is how surreal is that? We live in New York City. But here's, I think, what's different for my experience is it evolved, and I think it was common for students. You could have all things true. You could have a student who lived a life in New York City who attended Barnard College. You could have a student who lived a life at Barnard College and every once in a while explored life outside. But I think most students found some sort of balance between the two that evolved over their 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of students, their first semester, year, spend a lot of time right at Barnard, maybe venture out a little bit into Columbia. And then as years go on, they take more and more advantage of the city, less as a visitor, as a tourist, and more as someone who is now living in part of the city. I mean, in terms of all the student discounts you get and the student access you have, as being a student with a student ID card in a big city, it is just like free access to every kind of museum, discount tickets to shows. A lot of restaurants give discounts to students as well. But I don't think I took as much advantage of that right away. And it was more of the shock and awe of, I am in New York City, I live here, at the very beginning.
I think that's true for most students, is that you really want to get your bearings. You want to meet other people. You want to figure out your dorm. You want to figure out the expectations of your classes. But as time goes on, the city becomes a resource in many ways. You're pointing out all of these opportunities to engage with the culture of New York. Lauren, you're pointing out, this internship that was ubiquitous among Georgetown students. I think it's great. It's not always the case that that's what students are thinking about when they think about going to college in a city. What are some common misconceptions that students have, or things that maybe the two of you are more attuned to as counselors, where students are like, I want to go to school in a city because, and they say something and you're like, that's not the reason to want to go, or you're going to find that it's not going to be exactly the way that you expect that to be. Does that ever come up in your counseling? This seems like maybe a hard question. So let's start with Tova on this one.
Oh, sure. Now. I think the misconception sometimes comes with size of city. They say city, and in their head, they mean New York, DC, Boston, Chicago, LA, and that's it. Mm-hmm. I once was at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska. And how quick are people to dismiss Omaha, Nebraska as farm country? Omaha is a thriving metropolis. There are a whole bunch of financial headquarters there. They have this really cool, funky, artsy downtown. The U.S. National Swim Trials are always there. The Little League World Series is always there. And it can be have the same opportunities as any city can offer. So I think sometimes students are quick to dismiss a small city, not realizing it might have the exact same advantages of why they might be drawn to a city. And what does city mean? It doesn't have to be one of the top 4 or 5 voluminous wise. And as long as you have an urban classification, you might still get all those advantages that we're talking about.
Gotcha. So broaden your definition in some respects. Yeah. Lauren, what do you think?
I think maybe a misconception, and I don't know, because I did not go to a rural school and I did not go to an NYU or a GW that is very much, in and of the city. But I think a lot of students that I talk to and say, well, I don't want to go to a small school, or I don't want to go to a school in the middle of nowhere because I need to meet new people. I need to be around, I want to feel alive in the city. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, I think a city can be a very lonely place. Just because there's so much going on around you does not mean that is, that you can't have, that's, everything, right? So, and my mom, I started this off by saying I was going to NYU, and my mom was very clear. She didn't want me to go to NYU because it was the loneliest she ever was, right? And so, it's just really, and she transferred from Muhlenberg. She's like, I had more friends there. But again, so the draw of a city, sometimes there can be a misconception. I think that's regardless. I think there's a level of independence a student should come in with, of say, if you say you're going to take advantage of these things, what does that really mean in practice?
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking of the difference between meeting people at a big party versus a dinner party, right? So at a
Mhm.
dinner party, there are fewer people to talk to, but there are going to be conversations. Like you're going to connect with people, like it or not. At a big party, you can very much just kind of float through and not talk to people. And
Yeah.
there's this kind of common misconception, I think, that lots of college students have, that everybody else has it together and they don't. It's like, how do they know each other? How have they made friends? But those other people, meanwhile, are looking at you and saying, how did she have it together? How did she have friends already? So, and I think that can be exacerbated in a city where there's so much life that's happening around you. And you're wondering, why am I not a part of all of these things? I'm just going back to my dorm room to eat, microwave pizza, which I imagine is okay in New York as well, right? Can you do that? Okay.
I mean, no, I'm not going to let you eat microwave pizza in New York City. Pick a different food you're going to
go to a
make.
pizza place. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. I do appreciate these like different sense of scenes and settings. One of the things that I think is a devil's advocate's perspective is you go to college for the college experience, and you can never really have that experience on campus again in your life. But if you want to live in New York, you can do that in your late 20s. You can do it in your early 30s. It's something that you can have in a different context. What is your thinking around, is there something really special about being a student in a city that captures the best of both of those worlds? Or is there an argument to be made that when you're living in New York, you really just want to be living in New York and not worrying about your philosophy homework?
I would jump in really quickly to say that when I graduated, I felt like I was still in college. Pretty much nobody left. All of my friends stayed in Washington, D.C. It was all of our first jobs. It was a very easy transition. All of a sudden I was like, whoa, there's a whole city out here. Finally, I took it. So I did get the college experience and then the city experience, with just nobody left. And I don't know that's necessarily the same for a rural school.
Interesting. Tova, what do you think?
Similar. I stayed too, as did many of my friends. But as an adult, which I think I can call myself now, 20 some years later, 25 some years later.
Look like one at least. Mm-hmm.
I can say confidently, we could say room and board in college is expensive. Oh my goodness, $1,200-$1,300 a month room and board these days. That is dirt cheap in New York City for a heck of a lot nicer than you're ever going to be able to afford as a recent college grad. Do you want a nice apartment that you can afford? College might be your cheapest option to live in New York City. And a room overlooking Broadway. I assure you, it was many, 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 many more years if I would ever be able to afford that kind of living in New York City.
Before we go out to the country and hear a little bit about Ryan, what Ryan has to say, I think often students are kind of considering different situations. There are kids out there that say, I'm going to be in a city, period. And so I'm only looking at New York, Boston, Chicago schools. But then I think there are a lot of students who will say, well, NYU's on my list, but I'm also going to go look at Vassar and I'm going to check out Hamilton. And, there's going to be a mix of potential schools. When students are visiting an urban campus or a city campus, what are the things that they should be paying attention to and looking for as a way of getting a feel for what life might be like there? Because there's a lot of noise, literally and figuratively, in a city. How do you tune some of that out and make sure you're getting the best perspective you can? What do you think, Lauren?
Well, I just don't know that it's any different. The questions that I would ask are no different. If I was going to go tour Kenyon College versus Columbia University, like, to me, it's the same questions of getting off of the tour a bit, or asking very targeted, personal, off script questions to the tour guide, sitting in the dining hall, looking at what student organizations are going on. So it's connecting with students, but I think it's still fundamentally the same questions, no matter the location.
It's a good reminder to compare apples to apples. So if you're going to ask these questions here, ask them there as well, and just see how the differences come in terms of those responses. I like that. Tova, what do you have to add?
A little of substance, because that was perfect. Ask direct questions. What do you do on Thursday nights? What does your roommate do on Thursday nights? What does your friend who lives down the hall do on Thursday night? What about Friday, Saturday? It's if it's a school that has a parking deck and you're in an urban environment, one of the tips an old colleague used to say is go walk in the parking deck and look at the license plates. Do you get the impression everyone's going to be leaving on the weekend because they're all local, or they from all over the country? And asking what weekend life is like. One of the things that I think is great is find out, is there something to do different 7 days a week, right there on campus. You never have to leave the gates or the walls or the few blocks to have a vibrant experience, because that might be where you start out, even if the city was the draw. You want to know, as Lauren said, is this my jam? Is this my vibe? Are these my people? And ask those same questions you would ask for any school you're looking at.
Could you imagine if NYU was just like, we don't have any student life. We've got New York. Yeah, we haven't planned any activities. We don't sponsor any clubs. Just go explore the city. That would be dereliction of duty. Thank you both for coming on the show. It's fun to hear a little bit about your college experiences and how you made that choice. Maybe we'll get to talk a little bit more about that on a future show or over a beer or something like that. Thanks for coming on.
Sounds like fun.
It does. Thanks, guys.
All right.
Bye.
When we come back, we are going out to the country in Hamilton College. We're going to talk to one of our colleagues about life in a more rural setting. So stick around.